Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today I'm going to be doing Series Port Authority, where I compare some of my favorite arcade games of all time directly against their home console counterpart. If you can't tell already, we're playing California Speed, first released in arcades by Atari, and then ported over to the Nintendo 64 following that. And this is definitely going to be a very big night and day difference between the arcade version and the home console port. And while the Nintendo 64 port is not a bad game by any sense of the imagination, it is definitely not the arcade version, and it suffers for not being so. You'll see right here we come into the port of San Francisco. This is a wide open, bright, cheery game with a ton of polygons running at a very good frame rate, where in the Nintendo 64 version you didn't even get that cityscape. This game doesn't just suffer from graphical downgrades, it also removes parts of the track if those parts had too much vista in the background where you could kind of see too far into the distance, and that is just an absolute bummer. Now, I actually played this game first on Nintendo 64 and definitely enjoyed it back in the day. Then I actually found an arcade cabinet a couple years later, played it, and realized that what I was playing on Nintendo 64 was completely different. You'll see here all of these houses in San Francisco are a blurry, muddy mess. The frame rate has definitely taken a big hit, and overall it's just not a very attractive looking game. If we go side by side going over the Golden Gate Bridge, you can just see how muted the color profile is, how many fewer polygons are on screen at once, and just how much slower the game runs, because we're going the exact same speed, but you'll see here in the Nintendo 64 version we are lagging behind in the race. It kind of feels like you're racing through mud the entirety of California Speed on the Nintendo 64, and it really does take away the joy and sensation of speed when you're playing an arcade racing game. And California Speed is every bit as good in my opinion as San Francisco Rush, not as many shortcuts, but still has that blistering sense of speed and just overall mayhem. And you'll see here as we get further on into the track, we're going to go into the train system underground. It's bright, you can see what you're doing, you can recognize that as a train. Everything looks and feels and sounds good here. Unfortunately, once we go back to the Nintendo 64 version, pun very much intended, it is a day and night difference. But if you've never played California Speed before, I can't recommend you do it enough. It's one of those classic arcade racing games I love. Now, in that same tunnel in the Nintendo 64 version, it definitely is a little bit more vibey, but again, it just doesn't really read like it did in the arcade version. It's darker, it's muddier, all that fun, bright, cheery nature of the original California Speed is gone out of this game, and when you think of California, you think of bright blue skies and sunshine and poppy colors, not this muddy, muted color palette and this very cloudy sky in the background indeed. But let's move over to the next course in the race, and you'll see again how big and wide open the courses truly are in California Speed. Every single building in the background is made up with polygons, as well as all of the different mountainscape there at the Hollywood sign. And the game runs at a very nice frame rate with awesome physics and handling controls. Atari did a great job when it came to San Francisco Rush, and they extended that over to California Speed. As we move into the exact same area on the Nintendo 64 version of the game, you can just tell in the motion cadence and overall clarity here, it is not doing the same thing at the same frame rate. And I think that is the #1 downgrade compared to the arcade version coming up right now. The frame rate just absolutely tanks itself, and you take into account the absolutely different overall visual stylings and colorways, and it just makes it feel like maybe this is something that should have been held off for Dreamcast, because California Speed only got one home port, and that was the Nintendo 64. And that does make sense. Pretty much all of these games, San Francisco Rush, Cruisin' USA, World and Exotica, California Speed, and the like, all got ported to Nintendo 64. It seemed like the target console of choice for ports. As we pop into the LA aqueducts here, you're going to see just how fun it is having that ceiling above you and racing down this waterway. It really does feel like you're racing in a place that you shouldn't be racing. We move over to the Nintendo 64 version, that overhang is missing completely, everything is styled differently, and it just doesn't really feel like you're doing 167 miles per hour. It kind of feels like you're doing 40 in second gear, and that is the big bummer about this port. It is a racing game that doesn't really make it feel like you're racing all that fast. When we pop back over to the arcade version, the speed, intensity, and color come right back in. The one nice thing is the Nintendo 64 version got a really good port as far as the soundtrack and sound quality are concerned, so go ahead and listen for 45 seconds, first the arcade version, then the console version.
Track record.
two different tracks with two different sound quality outputs, but they both overall have a good tone to them and they really want to make you race fast. But unfortunately, again, as we go side by side, you can just see the complete difference in the game speed sensation between arcade and Nintendo 64, and that is what makes or breaks an arcade racing game. If you're doing 200 miles an hour on the speedometer, you want to feel like you're doing 200 miles an hour in the game. You want everything blowing past you and just moving fast, which we 100% get over on the arcade board to the right, but on the left on Nintendo 64, it just feels sluggish. That is the big thing. If this game had the graphical downgrades, if it had the less colorful, cheery nature, that would be totally fine so long as it actually ran at a frame rate in-game that made it feel like you were really ripping down the highway at speeds that would absolutely get you charged with felony reckless driving. And as we move back over to the arcade version and come into this downtown area, I just love the vistas in this game. This is basically just San Francisco Rush with a different theme on it. Obviously, we've gone to the entire state of California at this point in time, and everything this game does, I absolutely love. I did a video on this maybe probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, just overall reviewing it and saying it's one of the best arcade racing games of all time in my opinion, and I still definitely stand by that. As we come down here into the pier and get close to getting onto that actual roller coaster, you'll see there the car flips into the air, which is something that doesn't generally happen in the Nintendo 64 version. Now going through that same downtown area, you're going to see just how less complex the buildings are and just how absolutely overall muddy the textures can be, and that's just down to the Nintendo 64's very small texture cache. But this is another area in the game where the course completely changes. We just have to get to the roller coaster by driving through what seemed to be a highway on a pier. It doesn't make much contextual sense, and it is disappointing that some of the tracks in this game actually deviate design-wise from the arcade version, because the tracks in the arcade are 10 out of 10 Atari racing good, and when we come to the port, for the most part they are the same, but when they actually differ and change, it is not for the better, and that's just another bummer. Why did they actually change the tracks compared to the arcade originals? Probably just because some areas had too much polygonal complexity on the number count. As we get onto the roller coaster here, one of the most fun parts of the game, the fun is still here, and this is one area in which the game actually feels like you really are going fast, maybe because you can actually see the ground underneath you, and it gives you that sensation of perspective. And you'll see here as we dip back down, the game will chug every once in a while. Now if we move over to the same area on the arcade version, again, this is just an absolute contrast in performance and visual clarity. And really, I just wish that they had brought these bright colors over to Nintendo 64, because it's not like that console's hardware couldn't do bright. You have stuff like Kirby 64, Super Mario 64. It was very easy to have a bright game on that console, so I'm really not sure why on the design in the port they decided to mute all the colors down and make it a very drab affair. That just doesn't work for California speed, especially if you play the arcade version first. And again, just the overall speed and intensity here, I absolutely love the arcade version, and knowing you can play it on MAME if you want to should really obsolete the Nintendo 64 version outside of nostalgia purposes, because when we move back over to the footage, you'll see here again, it just is the same game, but it doesn't have the same fun factor. It kind of feels like the Kirkland brand port of the arcade original, name brand versus the knockoff brand, and that is not to knock the developers. Obviously, the Nintendo 64 hardware was in no way, shape, or form anywhere near as powerful as the arcade board that this ran on. We're talking about completely different generations in hardware, and that's why I'm really surprised this game didn't end up seeing a port to the Sega Dreamcast. That's where it would have really shined, and that's why you see stuff like San Francisco Rush 2049 being so much better on Dreamcast than on Nintendo 64. As we go into Silicon Valley here, one of the most inventive courses in the game, you race through a little computer with actual components and other chips inside of it. This was one of the first courses I ever played on Nintendo 64, and I love the weird sense of humor that the game brought across. You're going to see here we're going to go buy some fuses and even go to a little heat sink off a sound amplifier chip. It is very fun to actually see this happen, and it is 3DFX branded because that is the hardware that was on the arcade board. And we move over to the Nintendo 64 version. The overall concept is still intact, but again, it is just completely degraded in the quality and overall appearance, and I would say that California Speed is one of the uglier games on Nintendo 64. Leave me a comment down below and you tell me which one do you like better and which one have you played. I'm assuming people have at least played the Nintendo 64 version, and some people maybe played the arcade as well, but I love you drive into a VGA port at the end here. Now, as far as the port authority is concerned, it's the arcade version coming up ahead, 7 days a week and twice on Sundays. See you guys next time. Bye bye.